ever eaten your entire life. We need that for an influenza vaccine. And we also need to not forget that for influenza, vaccines aren't the only part of the solution. I mean, it's so easy to get caught up. If you want to get sexy in influenza, you do stay in the vaccine space. But if you go into the diagnostic space or the therapeutic space or non-pharmaceutical intervention, those are the early steps that will make a huge impact on bending that epidemic curve for seasonal and a pandemic outbreak. And so we have to have that single focus entity focus on stopping influenza, not only on making a vaccine.
Did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it is in case we haven't figured this out already, this is really very complicated, not only from a scientific and public health standpoint, but from a perception standpoint. So Casey, taking your point, certainly it's not boring when you delve down and see what the ultimate impact is, both cumulatively each year, as well as the intermittent time that we get a pandemic. But let me tell you how things really fall into a different category. It's the diversity of what influenza means to the community. For some people, they get the flu, the real flu, not like I have a stomach flu, but the real flu, they get better. So there's sort of this perception. If it's so serious, how come people get flu each year and it isn't a catastrophe? When you're dealing with a disease like HIV, if you get HIV, it's serious. Whether you're young, whether you're middle-aged, whether you're old. If you get cancer, that's bad. Whether you're young, whether it's intermediate. Whereas with influenza, for some people, they go throughout life, it doesn't impact them at all. There isn't anybody that's afraid of influenza. You go in a focus group and you say, are you afraid of getting HIV if you're at risk? Oh, absolutely. Are you afraid of getting cancer? Absolutely. Are you afraid of the flu? Don't bother me. I mean, that's the reality of how people perceive flu. As Rick said, we're responsible for a variety of diseases making countermeasures, malaria, tuberculosis, Zika, Ebola, on the middle of Ebola right now. So you go to the DRC, where I went to a week and a half ago to visit our sites, and you ask somebody, are you worried about influenza? They'll laugh at you. What are you talking about influenza? They don't vaccinate their people for influenza because they have enough problems with malaria and tuberculosis and now Ebola. So it is a perception, which is a misperception, that it is not a serious disease. But as Casey said, hundreds of thousands of people die of it each year, and when you get a pandemic, millions and millions of people. So we really do have a problem of how the world perceives influenza, and it's going to be very difficult to change that unless you do it from within and say, I don't care what your perception is, we're going to address the problem in a disruptive way and in an iterative way, because you do need both.
In the long run, over time, amortized, if the 2009 pandemic had been much more deadly, would that have ended up being a better thing for humanity? Come on, be honest.
Would it have been? No. Because, we had not certainly as serious as the 1918, but we had a pretty bad pandemic in 1957 and 1968. That didn't change much.
But wasn't that before? I mean, don't we have some biotechnological tools now at our disposal that we didn't then?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, the sad truth is that when there's a major crisis, it focuses attention and usually resources and some significant mobilization follows. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are using resources in the best way possible, though, because it's done in the moment of crisis, and right. There's throwing money at things that sound good without them being thought through, and then there's what we used to call the U-shaped curve of concern, where there's the initial increase in interest in resources, and then when the problem fades and other problems emerge instead, then everything drops off. And I think we've been in that with many different outbreaks of disease and flu to some degree as well. I think part of what Casey was pointing out and others on this panel were pointing out is that we need, number one, this time to be different, and we also need to really organize ourselves in a way where there will be accountability for sustained action and not just response.
So let's talk about the science a little bit more. Craig Venter, who is a controversial person, but interesting to me, has written that he thinks we ought to have a vaccine such that if you take off in a plane from Hong Kong and are infected, by the time your plane lands in New York, there ought to be a vaccine assembled and deliverable to you. How crazy is that? How far are we from that? Are we ever going to get there?
I'm not going to say how far away, but I don't think that's too crazy. I think that if we move towards the era of synthetic-based vaccines, I think we remove the dependencies of thinking the vaccine has to be something that we have to grow into something else, in an egg, in a cell, or an insect cell, any type of dependency on growth. If we can move into more synthetic, the nucleic acid-based, messenger RNA-based, those sequences can be rapidly shared around the world. Enzymes that can synthesize the small fragments of messenger RNA necessary to go into the vaccine can be made in a shoebox size system right now, which is translatable into a 3D printer-like or inkjet printer-like thing. Now, putting those in a system to print those on a patch that a self-administered vaccine could happen, the technologies are out there. We haven't demonstrated their true effectiveness and ability for a vaccine, but it is not too crazy to think that an outbreak of a novel avian virus could occur in China somewhere. We could get the RNA sequence from that, beam it to a number of regional centers, if not local, if not even in your home at some point, and print those vaccines on a patch and self-administer. We're a ways out, but the technology is there to be adapted, assembled to put in that futuristic view of a rapid response to an emerging novel threat.
How much more do we need to know about immunology?